Hey everybody, Miss Veronica back again today, and you'll notice that I'm sitting comfortably in my chair and I don't have an apron on. That is because we're not doing a demonstration today. At least I'm not doing a demonstration today. Today we're going to chat about something that is very cool. We're doing a little bit more science focused today, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know that plants are very important to me. I love plants. I have them all over my house. I also eat a lot of plants. A lot of the things that we have made together are plant-based dishes and snacks. So we've talked about how important plants are, both for eating, for the environment, everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about how plants can survive in some places that should be really difficult for them to grow in. So before we get started, I want to just give you a reminder about the parts of a plant. So if you'll recall how plants work, I have one here. At the very bottom is the roots. The roots are what is in the ground or the vermiculite, whatever it is that we're growing in, and they are responsible for kind of sucking up the nutrients and the water from the ground, from the soil, from whatever it's planted in. They also stabilize the plant, so if there's a lot of wind or anything that could blow it over, it kind of can stay rooted where it is. Get it rooted right where it is. So the roots, obviously, incredibly important for the plant. Next we have the stems. These little guys right here, and the stems kind of act like a straw. They kind of suck up those nutrients and that water and everything from the roots, and they carry it out to the leaves. The leaves are then responsible for photosynthesis. They're responsible for getting the light from the sun that's going to then make the food, the nutrients that the whole plant needs in order to be healthy and survive. So those are the main parts of the plant, and that's important because what we're going to talk about has a lot to do with those individual parts. Now, there are places in the world called deserts. We all know this. We've all seen deserts on TV or even cartoons and things like that. A desert really just means it's a place that has such an extreme temperature and climate that it's very, very difficult for animal and plant life and things like that to survive and thrive there. Now, there are deserts all over the world, but there's two different kinds. Usually when we think of desert, we think of a hot desert. We think of a place with the sun beating down, sand as far as the eye can see, maybe a cactus here and there that we'll talk about in a minute, camels, things like that. But there's also cold deserts as well. There's also places that have such an extreme cold temperature that plants and animals have a hard time there as well. And those would usually be around the north and the south poles. And hopefully you've seen pictures and things of cold deserts as well. We are going to mainly focus on the hot deserts today because there are some really interesting things going on in those deserts. Now, deserts in particular also do not get a lot of precipitation. I am assuming at the beginning of your school year, at least this year, you learned about weather and precipitation and different types of precipitation like rain and snow and sleet and all that good stuff. Snow and ice are usually what fall in our cold deserts, and then in our hot deserts, their form of precipitation is rain, but they don't get a lot of it. That's why deserts tend to be very, very dry. There is not a lot of precipitation. And one thing that we know about plants, because we did this when we made our garden a bottle, is we know that plants need water in order to survive. And that's pretty much across the board. They all need water. So what happens when they're in a really hot, dry place where there's not a lot of water? What happens? I'll tell you. So what needs to happen whenever something needs to survive and thrive in a place where it's very difficult is they need to adapt. Now, you may have heard the term adapt before, and basically that's just changing yourself or whatever it is in some way that makes it easier to survive in your surroundings and the climate that you're in, or with any kind of dangers that might be around. This is mainly for animals, things like that. You can adapt and change. We do it a lot. If I suddenly moved to a different climate, I would have to adapt. If I moved from California up to Michigan, I wouldn't continue living like I was in California. I would have to then buy a coat. I would have to buy snow boots. I would have to adapt to the new weather conditions that I were in. There's a lot of ways that we can adapt, and so can plants and animals. And over long amounts of time, plants and animals can adapt to their surroundings, to new surroundings as the environment changes, or as industry and buildings and stuff start to go up. Plants and animals need to adapt, and that's what we're going to talk about today, specifically plant adaptations in a hot desert. So let's talk about how that works. So there's a few different things that need to happen in order for different plants to adapt to that kind of climate. First off, we talked about the fact that they need water, and they usually get that water from their roots in the soil that they're in. But their roots might need to change a little bit in order to be able to get the water that they need. There's two different kinds of adaptations when it comes to roots in desert plants. One, they can develop what's called a tap root, T-A-P. And what that means is they end up growing a long root, can just be one root, that goes way down into the ground. There's usually water the further down you go. It's why a lot of people dig wells, is because there's water further down below, and the water that comes from the precipitation from the rain doesn't evaporate as fast down below. So the taproot will go way into the soil, and that's how it ends up getting the water that it needs. The other thing that can happen is that it can develop a lot of tiny roots. So if I were to pull up this plant right now, you would see some very long, just kind of spindly roots that kind of all twist around on each other, and that's how a lot of plants usually work. But these plants in the deserts have to get these kind of just like tiny little roots that come out, and they suck up the water that's kind of on the top. So if it rains but not enough for the rain to really soak into the soil, you've got to have those little roots on the top. They're going to just suck up as much water as they can before it's gone. So the way you can imagine it is if there was, instead of a glass full of water for you to drink, there was a lot of glasses that each had just a little bit of water in them and a straw. So you're really thirsty, you really want to drink water. One of those little glasses is not going to cut it for you. But if you could use your straws and suck the water out of all those glasses, you might actually get enough water to make you not thirsty anymore. And so that's what those roots are doing. So again, there can either be a tap root, the really long ones, or it can be a bunch of little short roots that can suck up the water that's on the top. So that is the roots. Okay, now we're going to talk about the kind of stems and leaves. They do some really cool things as well. Now, the leaves are important for, again, the sunlight, for photosynthesis, for making its food. But a lot of the plant adaptations in the desert, the leaves end up cupping and kind of turning as well. And so when that happens, it's basically collecting water, almost like a little cup, and then funneling that back to the rest of the plant. So they're making the most of the water that they get. They're not getting a lot, so they've got to make the most of it. So those leaves will kind of turn up and form a little cup and funnel that water back to the rest of the plant. Another thing, because plants do require the water that's coming up through the roots and the stem, a lot of these plants will actually lose their leaves if there's not a lot of water, and that makes it so that there's not a lot of water that's needed in order to keep it alive. Usually when we see plants, especially our house plants or our plants outside, if they start losing all their leaves, we usually assume that the plant is dead or dying. But it does that on purpose in the desert, and it does that so that the rest of the plant can survive, and the leaves can come back later, but it means that there's less water needed to get to the leaves. Another thing that's very cool is that these different plants can actually form a waxy coating on the outside, and that can hold water inside of the plant. It kind of keeps it from evaporating really fast, so it keeps it from sort of sliding off of the plant. That waxy coating kind of holds that water inside. And that actually brings us to a cactus, and a lot of you have seen cacti before. A lot of you may even have them in your house. A lot of people keep them grown in nurseries and things like that, but they actually grow very well in the desert, and those plants don't have any leaves. Cacti are just stems, basically, with those little pointy needles on them. And a lot of times those needles, or if there's desert plants that have kind of a fuzz or something like that on them, that's acting as sunscreen to actually keep those plants from getting too hot or from burning in the sun, which is so cool. But the coolest thing about cacti is that they kind of act like nature's plant camels. Like a camel stores water in its hump so that it can go a really long time without needing to find water. Cacti do the same thing. They've adapted so that they can actually store water within themselves, so that if there's a long period of drought or a long period of time with no water, they'll have enough in order to survive. Cacti are very cool. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of them as well. Now, one of the cool things about these desert plants that have adapted over time and can now thrive in these hot, arid, kind of really difficult environments is that a lot of these plants are edible. And you know how much I love to eat plants. So we're going to talk about some of these plants that are edible in the desert. They have been used especially by indigenous people for hundreds of years. There's deserts in the United States where people still live. There's deserts in Texas, in New Mexico, in Utah. Most of them are in the southwestern part of the United States, Arizona, things like that. So you can go visit a desert if you wanted to do that. So we're going to talk about some of those different plants, and I'm going to go over them with you. It might seem like a lot of them, but they're very cool, and I want to tell you exactly what they do. I'll show you pictures along the way. When this video is done, you have the option to do a match game with these desert plants. It's an online game. I will link it in the description below, and that is going to let you take the description of the plant and the picture of the plant and match them together. So I'm going to go over them with you now. You can watch it as many times as you like, but I want you to know about how cool these are. Okay, so we're going to get started with the first one. The first one we're going to talk about is the barrel cactus. This fruit is a little bit tart. It can be eaten raw or cooked, and the seeds inside, they have a really good source of protein. We talked about protein. It's the building blocks of the entire body. We have to have protein, and the seeds of this plant are really good for that, and they can actually be ground into a meal, kind of like flour. That's what we mean by meal when we talk about grinding something up. The next one we're going to talk about is a jojoba plant. Okay, it's spelled a little differently than you might think. It's Jojoba. And the waxes and the oils of the jojoba plant, they're produced from the seeds, and they're used for medicine a lot of times. So a lot of times that is used directly on the skin for sunburns, chapped skin. You can imagine that's really important if you were an indigenous person living in the desert. You might need something like that. You might even see jojoba oil listed as an ingredient in a lot of bath and body products that you even see in the store. You may even have some in your bathroom right now. It's very, very popular. The next one that we're going to talk about is the saguaro cactus. These only produce fruit once a year. They usually ripen by kind of late June, and the fruit's full of pulp and seeds, and it tastes a lot like a strawberry. You can eat it raw like you would a strawberry, or it can be made into jams, wines, syrups, all kinds of good stuff. So definitely a favorite. Now the next one we're going to talk about is desert agave. Basically, the flower and the stalks of the desert agave are both edible, and people use agave a lot. It's very sweet. Now the cola, it's spelled Cholla, And most varieties have edible parts. Their little flower buds are used for food. A lot of times the parts that are eaten when they're very young, because when they start to become older plants, their joints are very woody. It's very hard to eat them. Okay. Moving on to the mesquite tree. Now you may have heard of mesquite because a lot of times the bark is used when people are grilling to give it kind of a nice flavor. But the mesquite tree also makes these pods. They're kind of like bean pods, and they're used to be ground down into a flour, and then they're mixed with cornmeal. And they were really, really important to the indigenous people of Mexico in the Southwest. And once it's mixed with that cornmeal, it's a lot of times made into hot cakes or like a farina cereal, like you might have for breakfast in the morning, kind of like a porridge. So that was really important for people who were living there and even are living there now. Next is the ocotillo, Ocotillo. The bark of the ocotillo and the entire plant really contains medicinal properties, and it's really good for increasing circulation. So people would use that usually as a tea and things like that, and it was good for circulation in the body. Our next one is the palo verde. The seeds of this tree are edible. They're eaten a lot like peas or edamame. So you just kind of pull it off the tree, open up the pod. The pod's usually too tough to eat, but you would eat the little kind of seeds that are on the inside, just as if it were, again, peas or edamame. You can also eat the flowers raw in salad, which is really cool as well. So it basically means you could just pick it off the tree and eat it. Moving on to creosotes. It is different from creosote that we find in houses. If you've ever heard the word before, there is a word creosote that it usually means some kind of buildup in chimneys and things like that. That's usually where we hear that word. But creosote in this case is a plant that is used very, very medicinally. Indigenous people used to call it a cure-all because they use it for fevers, colds, stomach pains, cuts, for bacterial and fungal infections, all kinds of stuff. They'd make it into a tea, and this was basically their medicine, and apparently worked very well. All right, moving on to the desert ironwood, which is a fun name. The flowers and seeds of this plant are edible. They can be eaten raw, but they can also be sprouted or cooked. Delicious. And then my favorite name for any of these is the organ pipe. The organ pipe is a cactus. It's predominantly used as a source of calories and hydration for people in desert regions. So it's very important that we get enough calories to survive every day, and in some places that's difficult to do. But eating the organ pipe is very good for people to get the hydration and the calories that they need in order to sustain them. It has a lot of protein in it. Remember those building blocks for the body? We can get that from the organ pipe cactus. Last but certainly not least is my favorite. This is the prickly pear cactus. This cactus has a lot of different edible parts. The plant's pads can be boiled and served in a salad or eaten as a vegetable side dish. You don't want to eat the part that has the little spiny thorns, but everything else you can pretty much eat. The prickly pear fruit is very sweet. It can be eaten raw or cooked. It makes an incredible prickly pear jam. There's prickly pear syrups. There's prickly pear honey, all kinds of good stuff. And it's actually one of the easier to find of all these different plants if you actually wanted to try it. And you are going to try it. So one of the things that we are going to do is let you try some tea made of prickly pear. It's mixed with some other things as well. If you're getting the tea from us, it's not amazing to make as a tea on its own. It might taste kind of good, but it needs some other stuff to just kind of kick it up a little bit. So there's going to be some hibiscus flowers in there, some chamomile, things like that, but it will also have dried pieces of prickly pear fruit in it. So you're going to be able to taste what that's like. There is another video that I'm going to link in the description that's going to show you exactly how you're going to make a tea bag with your prickly pear tea. So we're going to give you the tea, and you're going to use the video and the materials that we are giving you in order to make your tea bag. So you'll have your very own tea bag of prickly pear tea that you can try, and hopefully that'll be exciting for you. I have some prickly pear jam that I really enjoy on crackers. It is a little bit expensive because it's a little harder to get because it's all in the desert. But if you can ever get some syrup or jam with prickly pear in it, I definitely recommend it. It's very, very tasty. So let's do a quick rundown of what we learned. So we talked about the parts of a plant, super important: roots, stem, leaves. We talked about how these plants in these hot deserts have adapted in order to be able to live with very little water in very difficult climates. Their leaves have changed shape. They've got waxy coatings. They hold water inside a lot of the times. They have their own sunscreen to keep them safe from the sun. There's a lot of different ways that these plants have adapted, growing their long roots or their short, tiny roots to be able to soak up as much water as possible. It is amazing that these plants have just kind of changed and adapted over time in order to be able to survive in such a tough place. So I hope you enjoy learning about these different plants and how they have changed for their environment, and learn about how we can eat them and how they've been important over time. I hope you really enjoy your prickly pear tea. And again, I'm going to link below the match game as well as the kind of top-down instructions for how to make the tea bag. And as always, I hope that you have a wonderful day, that you stay safe, and that you come back real soon. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.